Well, it's a pleasure to be taking part in this agritech careers series. My name is Hundleby and I'm a plant scientist. My area of specialism is in crop transformation, which means I produce GM and gene edited crops for the UK and international research community, using it very much as a research tool to help us gain a better understanding for what genes control what traits. I'm based on the Norwich Research Park, so the John Innes Centre is based there, but also alongside other research institutes. So we've got the Sainsbury Laboratory, which has a focus on plant health. We have the Earlham Institute, which is a genomics and synthetic biology research institute. We've got the Quadram Institute. They're very much interested in how food affects our health and have a particular interest in the gut microbiome. They work closely with the Norfolk and Norwich University Hospital. We're also home to the University of East Anglia, and also over 40 companies are based on the Norwich Research Park. So we're very much a real hub of bioactivity, bioscience activity here on the Research Park. We also have access to field stations. So at Barbara, we've got a research facility there with over 110 acres of land, which is used to do our field evaluations. And it's very important that we do research in the field. There's a limit to how much information we can gain from the glasshouse, so we very much need to validate these findings in real field environments. Now, what you can see in this picture here is we've got our GM field trials there, so in this very small little square that you can see in the middle. So here we've got some GM high iron wheat. So normally wheat accumulates iron in the bran, and with this particular bit of work the researchers have modified the plant so that the iron accumulates within the grain, so that you can produce white flour, which is naturally high in iron content, rather than fortifying it separately. We've also got gene editing trials there, and you can see in this picture at the top the effect making small deletions to 1, 2 or 3 copies of a particular gene has had on yield. And so this type of genetic technology falls under the Precision Breeding Bill, and I've been doing a lot of work with policymakers as to how we will regulate these crops going forward. So the overall remit for the John Innes Centre is really focusing on research that can benefit agriculture, the environment and human health. So our work falls into 4 strategic programmes. So we have one called Building Robustness in Crops. So here we're focusing on trying to understand the genetics, so the genes that control which traits, and the effect on the environment and climate change on how these genes are expressed. So ultimately we're looking at ways we can look at the genetics to increase yields, so changing plant architecture and things like that. We have a research programme which generally looks at molecules that are produced in nature, so both plants and microbes produce chemicals. So how can we harness these to increase the nutritional quality of food? How can we use these biological products to protect plants themselves from disease and pests, and indeed, can we use these therapeutic proteins to produce new antibiotics for use in animal and human use. So we have another research programme which is aimed at developing plant health for the future. So again, it's trying to understand the genetics behind how plants respond to disease and pests. So looking for genetic solutions for plants to protect themselves, and ultimately looking at ways that we can reduce the use of chemical inputs there. And then we have a big programme which is looking at designing wheats for the future. So wheat globally is a huge crop. We rely on it for about 20% of our calories. And with a growing population, we need to produce 60% more wheat by 2050. Now, when you consider that to develop a new variety can take between 15 and 20 years, we've got some quite ambitious tasks to be made there. But our advances on genomics is really helping speed things up there. So we're looking at, can we tap into some of that genetic diversity in wheats that are grown globally to produce wheats that maybe we want for drought resistance, or developing wheats for rising temperatures as well. So some really ambitious programs going on here at the John Innes Centre. I mean, it's a very exciting time to be involved in plant science. So it's not just scientists that help us deliver this work. So we're about 450 people on site at the John Innes Centre. Probably about 43 of those will be group leaders sort of driving the science, and they'll be supported by postdoc researchers. We also have a cohort of students. So we have master's students here. So the John Innes runs a master's programme in plant breeding, and we also have PhD students here. But around 200 of our staff would be fall under the research and support staff umbrella. And so this can be anything from our research assistants in the lab to the people who work in our media kitchens, making sure we've got all the equipment we need to do the research that we do, people who look after our plants in the glass house, to our science administrators, people who work in our knowledge exchange and commercialisation teams, people working in policy, and people working in science communication. So I think for you with agricultural backgrounds, there's definitely areas where your skills would be well used here at the John Innes Centre. So I was going to give you a very quick sort of run through of my own research career. So I started at the John Innes Centre back in 1995. So I came straight from university. I did a biotechnology degree at De Montfort University, spent a year in industry, tissue culturing trees at the Forestry Commission in Edinburgh. And so my remit when I came to the John Innes Centre was to develop GM protocols for horticultural brassicas. And 1995 was the height of the GM excitement. It's when the first commercial crops were planted in the US. But the climate for GM crops in the EU has never been favourable, and so this technology has very much been relegated to being a research tool for us. But it has been something that I've been using throughout my research career, and actually in 2006 we launched BRACT, which is our biotech resources for arable crop transformation. This is a transformation facility whereby we can train the next generation of scientists to be able to do their own transformation work, or we run a transformation service supporting researchers. Now, quite often in research, you work on multiple programs at once. Shortly after I finished my PhD, which I did part-time whilst working, I joined an EU programme between 2005 and 2013, which was called Farmer Planter. And this research programme wasn't agricultural based, so we were using plants to produce therapeutic proteins, and the aim was to take them all the way through to phase 1 clinical trials. And my role was to look at the biosafety and regulatory aspects behind that. So if we were to grow these crops in the field, what would the regulations be and the considerations that we need to take in place to make sure they didn't enter the food chain? Or should we grow them in containment? Should we use a food crop or a non-food crop? And again, what the implications would be. And then working with EU regulators, say like EFSA or EMEA, to look at drug regulations and how they could be adapted to working with plants. So if you think up until then, most of our sort of therapeutic proteins would be produced in animal or bacterial cell culture or chicken eggs. So this was very much a sort of a novel approach to producing these products. And it was a fascinating programme, and it really did give me insight into the world of policy. After that programme finished, we helped set up the International Society for Plant Molecular Farming, and that was launched into a small company in 2020 just because of our membership size. So that's something that I still keep a sort of a loose connection with. 2017, I was made an honorary lecturer at the University of East Anglia, so I lecture to undergrads and postgrads there, looking at the commercial aspects of GM and gene-edited crops. I'm also a chartered scientist, and last year I was also made a Fellow of the Royal Society of Biology. And I really want to highlight the fact that yes, I have a PhD, I'm a chartered scientist, I'm a Fellow of the Royal Society of Biology, which sounds great, but academically I wasn't a high achiever. At school, I found exams really hard. I just didn't have that capacity to memorise large amounts of facts. So it wasn't really until I got to university that I really sort of found my stride, and I'm much better at going off and researching and gathering information myself. So I did want to sort of spell out that, don't let your education as to where you are now define what your future is for you. Now my video cut off the last part of that timeline. So last year I had the opportunity to step outside of the lab and do something completely different for 3 months. So I worked as a science advisor and policy advisor for the Norwich Research Park. So I was working for the company that essentially recruits new companies to come to the research park, and I got involved in some fascinating programs as part of that. So one of the things that I did that was great was I helped to organise the Nuffield Scholars Conference. So that was held at the John Innes Centre, and I recruited scientists from across the research park to be able to work with these Nuffield scholars to answer some big picture questions, such addressing climate change and net zero and those kind of things, and then eventually the scholars presented their results of that in Westminster. I also got a chance to spend some time in Westminster last year as well, so I spent a week as part of the Royal Society's policy pairing scheme. So this is a scheme which selects 30 UK scientists, so that's across all disciplines of science, and it pairs them up with MPs or civil servants in order to gain insight into each other's world. And so you spend a week going into Westminster, learning how government works, how Parliament works, the difference between House of Commons, House of Lords, how new bills get passed. And then I spent a bit of time shadowing at the Food Standards Agency, so working with their GM and gene editing policy team. And this was particularly well timed because, as I mentioned before, we have a new precision breeding bill currently going through Parliament. And so that's been really interesting to see how scientists can influence policymakers. And sort of vice versa, so the impact we have on each other's work. So that was a really unique opportunity that came my way. And I've also had the opportunity as part of my job to actually go out and talk to different stakeholders. So again, last month I was at the National Farmers Union conference in Birmingham, which was a huge event. There's 1,400 farmers or people involved in the agritech industry there, listening to ministers and policymakers talking about agriculture. So that was fascinating. And then I got the opportunity to speak in a smaller workshop I think on this event it was to NFU Sugar, so looking at explaining the technology behind gene editing and what it could potentially offer to the sugar beet industry. So it really does give you the scope to so not only doing the science but also going out and explaining the science to people and how it can make an impact. So I think this kind of sort of summarises what I've talked about so far. So, as a scientist, my main sort of job is the crop transformation work. So developing new protocols for the research community, also training up the young scientists and the new scientists going forward. But also then we work with a whole host of different collaborators. So I get to sort of dip into lots of research, both across the UK and internationally. But it's actually the work that I do as part of my outreach and knowledge exchange, which I find really interesting too. And I've sort of talked about a lot of this already. So, lecturing to students, going out to talk to the general public. I did the Norwich Science Festival this year. The work I do with policy makers, briefing MPs. I got to brief members of the House of Lords this year as well. And working with journalists as well, so that can be quite interesting as well. And just sort of trying to convey some quite complex science in a very accessible way, and going out and obviously talking to breeders and industry. So I hope I've managed to convince you that a job in plant science covers a whole host of different things. So from actually doing the science to seeing where it can make impact, and I would thoroughly recommend it.